My dear friends, good day. Today, there is a real war around the reliability of information, and conspiracy is pushed to the forefront more than ever. But does asking questions mean that you are a conspiracy theorist? Well, fortunately not. We just have to take the precautions that go well and try not to confirm ourselves in hypotheses that we like, and that stick to what we wanted to find. Cross-check the information, confront it. That's the main thing. It's an investigation in short, and this investigative work has sometimes led to real conspiracies. But be careful, not those organized by so-called secret societies. No, today we are going to talk about real conspiracies, historical and even famous, for some of them. History is full of them, from the most successful conspiracies to those that have totally failed, from the most ancient periods to the present time. For example, the famous weapons of mass destruction that were supposed to be found in Iraq and that supposedly justified the American invasion in 2003. That must remind you of something. So, I'm teasing, but before we get to the heart of the matter, we need to agree on what is really a conspiracy. According to the Larousse dictionary, there are three possible meanings. Number 1, an attack on the fundamental interests of the nation. Number 2, the concerted resolution to commit an attack. And 3, the more or less reprehensible project of an action carried out in common and secretly. The secret? We're getting there anyway. There are so many historical examples of conspiracies, plots, cabals, and various machinations that one episode will probably not be enough. And that's why we're going to limit ourselves here to a few political conspiracies in particular. And we'll surely have another episode on the channel that will come back to this theme in the coming months. Come on, I've made you wait long enough. We'll get out our best raincoat, our magnifying glass, and our cap, and we will get into a time machine, where we will investigate. We are in Rome in 63 BC. The first conspirator we're going to talk about, Lucius Sergius Catilina, is from a rich family, but he has almost nothing left. He squandered everything in a life of debauchery, and the corruption of which one accuses him was obviously not enough to remake him. According to Sallustus, a Roman historian who told us about this conspiracy, Catilina is naturally wicked and depraved. He's a very nice guy. Peg-leg Pete and Mickey, you know. He is, of course, ambitious, and twice tries to become a consul. Not for the money, because, well, the function is not paid, but rather for the prestige and especially for the power that it brings. Apparently, we saw it coming because he was removed from the lists in 66 and 65 BCE. He tried again the following year, but another man beat him and became consul in his place. This is the famous Roman senator, orator, and writer Marcus Tullius Cicero, alias Cicero. Also alias Chickpea, his nickname, or cognomen Cicero, which means chickpea, and refers to an ancestor who would have had a chickpea-shaped wart on his nose. Far be it from me to compare myself to a consul. YouTubers are megalomaniacs, but there are limits, and I confess that I would be moderately warm to the idea of being nicknamed Nota Donut once I passed from life to death. In spite of his failures, Catilina persists. The year of Cicero's consulship, he runs again to become consul, but both posts are taken by friends of Cicero, and Catilina is again rejected. Bad loser, he decides with friends who are like him ruined and dissatisfied by the Roman Republic to set up a plot. A conspiracy, as it was said then. Their objective is to massacre their opponents, that is to say a part of the aristocracy, to burn Rome, and to seize power. And with that, to abolish debts, which is rather practical when you are yourself very indebted. But the plot doesn't start well. The first of the opponents, Cicero, escapes the assassination attempt on November 7th. The next day, pretending nothing's happened, Catilina shows up at the Senate and took a seat in the front row. The problem is that he does not know that Cicero has decided to denounce him publicly, and he strikes hard. His attack starts with these words. "Oh, come on! How far, Catilina, do you pretend to abuse our patience? How long will you have the insolence to taunt us?" Well, the guy doesn't even say hello, he attacks directly. Catilina hardly recovers from it when Cicero expands by detailing all the conspiracy and the threat which it represents. He finishes by deploring the inaction of the Senate with words which remain famous. O tempora, o mores. O the times, o the customs. Catilina has no art of repartee, and the Senate, convinced by Cicero, rumbles against him. So he prefers to slip away quickly. He joins an army of insurgents in Etruria, while leaving accomplices in Rome for a new plot planned a month later. But once again, Cicero denounced the plotters to the Senate. They are arrested and, after a vote, executed. Catilina dies the following year during a battle against troops sent by the Senate. Cicero is acclaimed by the crowd for having saved the city from destruction. But the glory is short-lived. 4 years later, as a result of political maneuvers, he is exiled. A tribune of the plebs and certain senators reproached him for having had the conspirators executed without having let justice decide. Yes, we choose our words well in this program. So Cicero has to go to Greece, while his house on the Palatine is destroyed. These indictments against Catilina, called the Catilinarian orations, are among his most famous texts. And the word in French even designates a vehement speech against someone. Like, "But did you see there's Chris Rock who still threw a Catilinaire on Will's wife on Snap? Crazy stuff." It's a clash. If there were a conspiracy Olympics, the Byzantine Empire would probably be on the podium. There are the most dubious deaths of assassinations, the overthrow of emperors, and all in the luxury, mosaics, and spices of the East. Irene is the first woman in Byzantine history to rule alone as basileus, i.e. emperor. You can imagine that it was not easy to achieve, and that she had to fight and plot a lot for that. She is the wife of Leo IV, and when he becomes emperor in 775, she takes the throne with him. But the reign is short because 5 years later, the emperor dies of illness. Their son, the little Constantine VI, is too young to rule, and Irene logically becomes regent. The empire is then torn by a terrible crisis, the quarrel of the images. To sum up, the veneration of religious images was always very common among the Byzantines, who not only considered them as representations, but also attributed miraculous powers to them. From 760 onwards, the emperors became suspicious of this cult, which they associated with superstition, and, probably influenced by Islam, they wished to forbid any religious representation other than the cross. This is called iconoclasm. So you learned some words along the way. Isn't it beautiful? Constantine V, Irene's father-in-law, went even further. He had religious images destroyed or removed and did not hesitate to attack the defenders of the images, notably the monks who ended up as martyrs for some of them. This opposition tears the Byzantine Empire apart between opponents and supporters of the images. Now, Irene is an iconodual. And no, this is not a Byzantine insult, even though it sounds like it, it just means that she is in favor of religious images. Problem: it is not the case for the Patriarch of Constantinople, an iconoclast placed by Constantine V, and especially all the administration of the imperial palace. Irene is therefore in hostile territory, and people are plotting against her, especially since many dignitaries do not appreciate being led by a woman. Nicephor, one of Irene's brothers-in-law, gathers around him supporters with the aim of taking power. But their plot is discovered. The conspirators are arrested and exiled. As for Nicephor and his brothers, to avoid any new attempt, Irene made them tonsure. They are ordained priests and thus cannot reign anymore. The tonsure, we've already talked about it in an episode of Game of Thrones dedicated to the March of Cersei, where we had seen together that hair at certain periods and in certain geographical areas was linked to power. So, obviously, if you don't have hair, you don't have power. It's symbolic, but symbols are important. Against the iconoclasts, Irene will make many enemies. She appoints a new patriarch on whom she can rely, and with him, she gathers an assembly of bishops, the Council of Nicaea in 787, which condemns the rejection of images and admits their veneration. The problem for her is that the army is very iconoclastic and has fond memories of Constantine V, an iconoclast who has won great victories. Whereas Irene seeks to remove her son from power, the regiments of Asia Minor rise, refuse to let her take the oath, and recognize her son as emperor. The revolt spreads very quickly and forces the regent to free her son from his apartments. Well, yes, it was her son. He was not in jail anyway. Well, it's a bit of a mess for him that it's mom who authorizes him finally to leave his room. Anyway, Irene is under house arrest, but she does not lose hope to come back, especially since Constantine VI is not very brilliant in war. He is beaten by the Bulgarians and the Arabs. He even ends up calling his mother back to him 2 years later. But Irene, either by a spirit of revenge or by reason of state, it is not very clear for the historians, decides to plot against her son to remove him definitively from power. It makes him hated by the army. He is told that one of the empire's most popular generals is planning a coup. Let's be clear, this is totally false. But Constantine has him arrested and blinded. The result is an immediate revolt by the soldiers, which ends up being crushed in blood. One could say that he had it coming, but honestly, it's tough because it's his mother, and she doesn't want to leave it at that. Her son is already married, but his heart beats for another woman, Theodote, a lady in waiting. Irene probably encourages her son's extramarital relationship. The unconscious even decides, perhaps under the interested advice of his mother, to repudiate his wife to marry his lover. And then, I don't tell you the scandal in the church and with the Byzantines. The last act of this descent into hell for Constantine takes place on the evening of August 18, 797. Some conspirators break into his room in the palace and gouge his eyes out with an awl or a hot iron. Which doesn't really make you want to go through with the same thing, huh? At this point, I feel sorry for the poor guy. It was a common practice in the Byzantine Empire to remove someone from power. Because a cripple, well, he cannot rule. And who knows why, but Constantine VI, after this, well, he's nicknamed the Blind Man. For Irene, who either ordered the act or let it happen, the way is free. She is proclaimed Basileus Emperor in the male form, and not just Basilissa Empress, a title used to describe the mother or wife of the emperor. Her reign was, however, complicated. Besides the resistance of some Byzantines to this female power, military defeats continue. Surrounded by many enemies, Irene did not see the palace revolution coming, which overthrew her on October 31, 802. She ended up in a convent on the island of Lesbos, where she died the following year. Despite the fact that she had smashed down her son, she remains a saint for the Orthodox Church, which appreciated her reestablishing the cult of images. So images are important. You probably all know Cardinal Richelieu, at least by name. Since he became the main minister of Louis XIII, the Cardinal of Richelieu collects enemies. The trust of the king and an excellent network of spies always preserved him from numerous plots and attempts to harm him. Well, it must be said that 60 musketeers as a personal guard also discourages assassins. After spending 18 years on this regime, he has developed a keen eye for detecting any threat. He looks closely at the company Louis XIII may keep, and if necessary, does not hesitate to recommend people he can trust. He thus pushes a young man, Henri Coiffier de Rouzet-Defia, Marquis de Saint-Marc, towards him, hoping he will become his favorite. And it's a total success, since the king can't do without him anymore. So much so that Saint-Marc accumulates titles and charges until he becomes a great squire. Everything seems to be going well, but soon Saint-Marc gets a bit carried away, and his new charges weigh him down. And for good reason. If the king likes him a lot, the opposite is less true. In his defense, Louis XIII, who has a rather austere personality, regularly changes his mood, and Saint-Marc would rather enjoy parties and a wild life. His pride will push him to ask too much. He falls under the spell of the Princess of Mantoue, Marie de Gonzague-Nevers, one of the richest fortunes of the kingdom, and of a much higher rank than his own. Saint-Marc, thinking he can get everything he wants, asks Richelieu for a title of duke that would allow him to marry the princess. And why not $5 and 1 marc while we're at it? Obviously, the cardinal refuses, and for Saint-Marc, the disappointment is total. This refusal pushes him to oppose Richelieu, for whom he now has a fierce hatred. All those who are plotting at the court get closer to the favorite. We see Gaston d'Orléans, the king's brother, conspiring against him. The Duke of Bouillon, involved in a previous plot against the cardinal. The Marquis of Fontrailles and Saint-Marc's childhood friend, François-Auguste de Thou, a young advisor to the parliament. A nice bunch of opponents to Richelieu who all want his downfall. And with all this, we must not lose sight of the fact that, at the time, France is engaged in the 30 Years' War. Allied with Sweden and German princes, the country is fighting Spain and the Holy Empire. Perhaps helped by Queen Anne of Austria, of Spanish origin, the Marquis of Fontrailles negotiates with Philip IV of Spain in exchange for Spanish military aid to ensure the success of the conspiracy. Gaston d'Orléans commits himself to sign the peace and to abandon the existing alliances. Spanish forces are massed in Sedan, ready to intervene. In 1642, when the court is in Lyon, the plotters plan to seize Richelieu and even kill him. But when Saint-Marc met the cardinal, he was in the presence of his captain of the guard, and the Marquis did not dare to act. Basically, he played the fool, but when it was time to roll up his sleeves, there was no one left. Bravo, Saint-Marc. Unlucky for him, shortly after this non-event, one of his letters containing the treaty with Spain is intercepted by the cardinal's police. This one thus learns the plot which is drawn up against him. I'll let you imagine the disappointment of Louis XIII when he learns that his forever friend is in fact a dirty traitor. I imagine it very well. The distant look, passive in appearance, but shaken up inside by a series of flashbacks, with a guy playing sad music on the piano nearby. All the conspirators are arrested one after the other. Gaston d'Orléans, in order to save his skin and obtain the king's pardon, confesses everything and denounces his accomplices. Though he is let free, he loses all his rights to the regency of the future Louis XIV. The fate is more cruel for the other plotters, including Dutroux and especially Saint-Marc, because they are judged in Lyon and condemned to death for the crime of lèse-majesté. However, they are still nobles. They are not driven to the place of execution in a cart, like the plebs, but rather in a carriage. A huge crowd gathered in the main square of Lyon for the execution, both to enjoy the spectacle, but also because Saint-Marc, 22 years old, was very popular. 1,200 soldiers are present to make sure that the execution will take place. On the other hand, the professional executioner having broken his leg, it's a butcher who's set to the task. And I might as well tell you that at that time, YouTube does not exist. There's no tutorial to be a butcher. And clearly it's not a job you can improvise. As a result, the execution is a real butchery. Well, yes, at the same time, it was not his job. It will take several sword strokes to separate the head from the body of poor Saint-Marc. And bon appétit, of course. The irony of the story is that the very ill Cardinal de Richelieu only survives 4 months of this last plot against him, and King Louis XIII follows him to the grave 5 months later. Finally, Saint-Marc would have benefited from a little more patience. Like me when I buy a game on Steam and it's free the next day on the Epic Store. So, for those of you who play on PC, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We're going to talk now about a plot that you might know a little bit more if you're a Tom Cruise fan, since it inspired a movie, Operation Valkyrie. And frankly, it's not very funny. In 1943, the military situation in Nazi Germany is getting seriously complicated, and some German officers doubt the victory and their Führer. Some think that Germany made a mistake by annexing the conquered territories. Others whisper that Hitler has lost his mind. Others understood that defeat was inevitable. Among them, Claus von Stauffenberg. He fought on the Eastern Front and came back horrified by what he saw. The crimes committed by the SS and the Wehrmacht, the massacres, the deportations, and so on. So he thinks that he must save what can be of Germany and preserve his country from the total ruin that is coming. And for that, he comes to a conclusion. Kill Hitler. Only that. And you'll have to get up early because Hitler has already been the target of more than one assassination attempt, and he has always escaped. Stauffenberg, who lost his right hand, 2 fingers on the left, and an eye in North Africa, can no longer serve at the front. This gives him time to get in touch with other officers and opponents who are trying to resist the Nazi regime. They gradually set up a plan under the code name Operation Valkyrie. Yes, we like Wagner and Nordic mythology in Germany at that time. The goal now is not only to kill Hitler, but also to re-establish a democratic German state and to negotiate peace with the Anglo-Saxons in order to better contain the Soviets in the East. Soon, Stauffenberg becomes the head of this group, and an opportunity is offered to him. He becomes the chief of staff of General Fromm, head of the Interior Army, and as such, he has access to a highly secured space, the Wolf's Lair, a blockhouse in Poland which serves as Hitler's headquarters. The plan is simple: to put a bomb under Hitler's table and blow up everything. The den, the wolf, and everything around. On July 20th, 1944, he arrives at the meeting with a small suitcase in his metal hand containing a bomb that he has primed. He pretends to make a call to leave the room. When the bomb explodes, 4 people are killed on the spot, but not Hitler. A terrible stroke of luck for him. An officer, embarrassed by his suitcase at his feet, moved it a little before the explosion, enough to save the Nazi leader. The devil's own luck. But Stauffenberg doesn't know that Hitler survived. Looking at the destruction, he even thinks that the attack has succeeded. He quickly joined a waiting plane and arrived in Berlin in the afternoon for the next part of the Valkyrie plan. With his military accomplices, he launches a message on the radio announcing the death of the Führer and decrees martial law and the overthrow of the regime. But Goebbels and Himmler quickly warn by radio that Hitler has survived. All orders are cancelled. The SS intervenes. Major Reimer, head of the Guard regiment, on whom the conspirators were counting to seize the ministries, changes sides. In the meantime, Hitler appointed him colonel and asked him to seize all the plotters. So he arrests Stauffenberg and 3 other officers, who are shot the same evening in the courtyard of the War Ministry. The next day, in a radio speech, Hitler denounces the criminally stupid group of officers who tried to kill him. The repression that followed was merciless, led by the SS and the Gestapo, and particularly targeted the army. Officers involved in the plot were shot, strangled, hung from butcher's hooks. Others preferred to commit suicide. Von Tresco, one of the organizers of Operation Valkyrie, blows himself up with a grenade. Even Field Marshal Rommel is forced to use poison to preserve his honor. The families of the conspirators are not spared either. Stauffenberg's wife was deported to Ravensbrück, and their 4 children were sent to orphanages. Nearly 7,000 people, more or less linked to the plot and the resistance, were arrested in the following weeks, very often tortured and judged after a sham trial. 5,000 were executed, most often by hanging. The SS then imposed itself within the army and took control of it. And this is the paradox of this plot led by brave officers ready to take all the risks to kill Hitler. Their failure will reinforce the Führer's obstinacy and will finally make the German army even stronger. Be careful, in this part, we're going to touch on an interstate thing. The kind of meddling that we like to assume today when there's an election that doesn't suit us very well, for example. Which doesn't mean it's not true, by the way. In short, in 1970, Salvador Allende, a doctor, was elected president of Chile. He was brought to power by the Popular Union, a coalition of left-wing parties ranging from communists to left-wing Christians. He did not receive a majority of the votes. It was the Congress that arbitrated in his favor, and it didn't happen by itself. The United States, which has always considered the American continent as its own, would prefer another more conservative candidate, Alessandro Rodriguez, and they lobbied for him to be elected. The Congress, dominated by the right, would have seen no objection to nominating Rodriguez. But besides that, Allende came out on top in the election, by 1 point certainly, but still. The pressure of the street is clearly in favor of the Popular Union candidate. The Congress therefore chooses him while remaining unfavorable to him. However, for the CIA, which did everything, but really everything, to prevent this nomination, it was a failure. Allende was elected on a rather reformist socialist political project. In other words, to achieve a new society through successive reforms. Wage increases, price freezes, social reforms, and nationalization of the country's major companies. The copper mines being, for example, the first national wealth. He tries to implement his program by respecting the Constitution, while trying to satisfy his electoral base, which is sometimes very left-wing. And as the old saying goes, it's not easy to walk straight when you're being pulled from both sides. The United States, which never wanted Allende in power, is thus using its favorite weapon: the economy. American companies in Chile refuse nationalizations and finance the opposition and strikes. American investments in Chile stop, as well as financial aid granted by the World Bank, an organization in which the United States is very influential. As a result, loans were divided by 3 between 1970 and 1973. Basically, the United States is doing what it knows very well how to do, which is to economically suffocate its neighbors. In Chile, protests quickly appear. Workers strike because they think the reforms are not going fast enough. On the other hand, the big owners and businessmen protest against the economic measures, the requisitions, and the nationalizations. Shortages increased and inflation soared. Prices increased 6-fold in 1972. The March of the Empty Pans, organized by an extreme right-wing movement called Patria y Libertad, is financed by the CIA. It brings together women from the upper classes and their employees to protest against the high cost of living. Other professions are also protesting against inflation or for specific rights. In short, it's a bit of a mess, and we wouldn't like to be in the place of the Chilean president. In October 1972, the country is shaken by important social movements. The bosses of the road transport companies, encouraged by the CIA, threaten to block the whole country, and the doctors, miners, and shopkeepers also call for a strike. We talk about Red October, and nothing to do with Sean Connery in a submarine. Salvador Allende loses some support. The most left-wing want to arm the masses to make Chile evolve towards a communist regime like in Cuba. The president tries to calm things down and unite the country by integrating members of the army and even the right wing into his government. The United States, on the other hand, maneuvered more and more against him. In 1971, the visit to Chile of Fidel Castro, the Cuban leader and sworn enemy of Washington, irritated Nixon. In the context of the Cold War, it seemed unacceptable that another country of the American continent could join the Soviet bloc. The CIA therefore increased its support for the opposition, and the Chilean army received more and more financial and material aid from the United States. A first military coup failed in June 1973, and 3 months later, on September 11, 1973, the military, led by Augusto Pinochet, attacked the presidential palace of La Moneda. The building was bombed by 2 fighter planes and then surrounded by 4 tanks and soldiers. Allende refuses to surrender or to resign. Because he believes he was elected by the people, he wants to remain faithful to them. He ends up killing himself with a Kalashnikov given to him by Fidel Castro. A tragic end no matter what one says, and to be clear, if the role of the CIA is not directly established in this coup d'etat, it is obvious that the White House is happy about it, and that the American Secret Services acted a lot against Allende before and after his election. Pinochet, proclaimed president without ever having been elected, then established his dictatorship with its share of torture, prohibition of fundamental freedoms, and summary executions. And this lasted until 1990, when, after a failed referendum and international pressure, he had to leave power. So this will not be the first nor the last time that the United States will come and make a mess of things outside of their own country for their only economic and political interests. And I know, we're seriously denouncing. Thank you all for watching this episode on the historical conspiracies that really took place. A program prepared with Stéphane Genêt, a historian and teacher from Tours, with whom I now collaborate quite regularly. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, we are already working on the continuation of this episode with other twisted conspiracies to present to you with plots worthy of the greatest spy books. Speaking of plots, we can say that if they had succeeded well, they would have created many interesting uchronies to imagine. Thanks again for your support. See you soon on Nota bene. If you want to see another video in the meantime, there are the end screens. You can click on a playlist. Bye.